My name is Dr. Alvaro Huerta, Associate Professor at Cal Poly Pomona. So I'm very happy to have a brilliant writer, scholar, practitioner, journalist, Roberto Lovato, to join us here today for a conversation. This is not an interview, this is a conversation between Roberto and myself regarding his brilliant book. I'm going to show a picture of it here. This is his book. So I just want to say I want to thank the library, Chris, for helping us organize this. This is a really excellent opportunity for us to discuss important issues that Roberto brings up in his brilliant book. I just read the book. I wasn't going to read it because I had read a lot of articles on Roberto, and I've seen a lot of his podcasts and different interviews. And I said to myself, well, I know this guy, so I'm going to go ahead and just have this conversation. But in conversations with him, he said, no, read the book. And after I read the book, I must say, people, my beloved students and everyone else that's joining us, this is a brilliant book. It's one of the best books that I've read in many, many years. And I hope that everybody reads the book. And I know that Roberto, for him, it's not just about reading the book, and buying the book, but it's also about inspiring other Latinos and Latinas to tell their own stories. So this is very important. So it's not just about book sales and things of that nature, but it's just empowering Latinos and Latinas in particular to tell their own stories, that they too belong, that they too matter, and that they too have a history. So I'm going to start this conversation with Roberto, like I start all my conversations with Latino men, and I'm going to diversify my future events with Latinas in particular, because they're wiser than the men. By saying this, Roberto Lovato and myself have a lot in common. We're both products of the University California, Berkeley. We're both writers. We're both activists. We both promote the Latino and Latina agenda. We both experienced violence and trauma and poverty growing up. Roberto has published a brilliant book titled Unforgetting, a Memoir of Family, Migration, Gangs, and Revolution in the Americas, by one of the biggest press in the United States. So it's a big accomplishment. So this is a conversation, once again, with Roberto Lovato, whom I know for many years, mainly through email and through friends of ours that we know each other. So today I want to talk about themes within the book and have conversations with it. I myself, just to give some background, I grew up in Tijuana, in housing projects in East LA. Ramona Gardens housing projects, big hazard. So I myself have experienced violence. I witnessed violence. Most of the friends that I grew up with are dead, are incarcerated, and never passed high school diploma. And I know these are some of the similar experiences that Roberto has experienced in his childhood. But given that, and as I mentioned in the email that I sent earlier this year, is that when reading Roberto's story, I saw that he experienced in his family, in his people, a deeper level of violence and a deeper level of of trauma that I've experienced. So I want to really get into that and get into his story, not necessarily to dwell on the trauma part, but to also dwell on the hope and on the resistance and on the example of what it takes to overcome trauma and to motivate young Latinos and Latinas, to push the agenda where we too have history, and we too can speak in writing in these big publishing presses, and we too matter. So this is what it's all about. In my case, to motivate students that have similar experiences like us, that it doesn't matter where you started, it matters where you're going, and to never give up the fight. So with that, I want to ask Roberto, in terms of, just give us a little bit of background about your own background, your own history, and what motivated you to write this book.
Well, before anything, thank you to Cal Poly Pomona, to the library, to you, Alvaro, who I've known through our mutual friend, Ruben Lizardo, as you're called. He called you Valo.
Yeah.
And your brother, a lot of affection that my friend Ruben has expressed for you all. And it's obviously transferred onto me, and an appreciation of your academic and intellectual work. I'm happy to be with everybody in the audience. A little bit about me. I grew up here in San Francisco. I'm here on Mission Street where I have an office, and I grew up about 3 blocks on a street called Folsom, which is when at the time had this giant housing projects that I lived down the street from. I grew up in a immigrant working class Salvadoran household in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And my brother went to school with Carlos Santana. So, like if you look at listen to Santana music and why people all over the world love it, it was because at that moment in history, San Francisco's Mission District was a magical place in terms of all the different currents: brown power, black power, hippie power, flower power, the Eastern kind of consciousness, strong labor movements, and the beginnings of the arrival of revolutionaries from Nicaragua and El Salvador, who were in the streets and organizing, because the revolutions came to San Francisco. They came to LA too, but one of the first places was San Francisco. And so that combined with the fact that my parents gave me a lot of love and another gift, which is my wings. I have like these wings that I had throughout my childhood. My father was a janitor with United Airlines, and my mom was a maid with Hyatt Regency Hotels. Limpiaba hoteles, mi mamá. I used to go clean them with her. And so my dad gave me free airline tickets. My mom gave me discounted hotel. So even though I grew up down the street from the projects and poor, I got to see the world in a way that like William Shakespeare would called having rich eyes and poor hands. So my motivation for writing the books is because I know the Salvadoreño community very differently from the way that we are written about, the way many Latino subgroups, Mexican, Chicano, Colombian, we all get our stories either told for us by others, or our stories are told in these really cartoonish and awful ways, as in the case of Salvadoreños, where like I did a study of coverage of the child separation issue last year, 2018, when Trump extended Obama's child separation practices and he made it a policy and he massified it. So I did a study that showed, I looked at it from the perspective of how many of these sources in the story, because I'm a journalist, right? So I'll look at what are your sources? The sources for the most of these stories, which was one of the biggest stories in 2018. How many Central American scholars like Lacey Abrego, Suyapa Portillo, Jorge Cuellar, Steve Osuna, and many others are in the story? How many Central American leaders like Larissa Cuadra here in San Francisco, or Marta Arevalo in Carece in Los Angeles? How many Central American lawyers? How many Central American journalists in one of the most popular stories? And you know what I found? Ni mierda, ni uno. And you're talking like hundreds of stories. So you can find the same pattern in literature where people like Joan Didion she's a brilliant writer, and she came out saying, wow, terror is the given of the place, talking about El Salvador. And I was involved in the war, as you know, as you read the book. I joined the FMLN guerrillas, so I've seen the terror, and it's real. But that's not all there is to us. And so my book is basically about how love is also the giving of the place and of the people.
Thank you for that, Roberto. Honestly, when I read your book, it was very inspirational and I cried a lot. I feel like taking it back to Amazon because it's full of tears and it's like, this book is affected. And you go in deep into your family and you're very vulnerable because you open up. So you're teaching us to be vulnerable, to open up. And this is something that unfortunately for Latinos and Latinas don't do, especially for the older generations, our parents, our grandparents. You know, they teach us to be quiet, to be silent. You know, my father, he fled Michoacan, a place where there's a lot of violence because there's a family feud. They killed my uncle. My father shot people. My father got shot at, and so on and so forth. So the violence and the silence kept us quiet for many years, and the trauma that they inherit. So to me, what I want to ask you is that, how did you learn how to write? You know, how did you learn how to tell your story where publishers will pick it up, where I know you've written, you've been picked up by major presses in terms of newspapers. Like, how did you learn the craft of writing so that your story would be accepted in your narrative as a Salvadorian American, given that you were born here in San Francisco? You know, and I say this because I want others to say that they too can do it too, right? So, but they have to know, like, what's the roadmap? You know, when I was at UCLA, most of the books that written about Mexico were from white scholars, Wilkie and others, and rarely did I get a book by a Mexican American or Salvadorian American about Central America or about Mexico. So how did you empower yourself? How did you learn how to write to the point where you were accepted and that you can tell your story in the language of your people, right? Mm-hmm. Using your language, the language of the colloquial, the language of the people themselves, without sanitizing it.
Well, it's no easy thing to be non-white, whether you're Black, whether you're Asian Pacific Islander, whether you're Latinx or whatever you want to call yourself. It's no easy thing to write in a system that is premised on racism. As we showed with like Dignidad Literaria, that you can maybe put a little thing on the hashtag there and people can look it up on Twitter, you know, where we challenge the publishing industry because only 1% of all the books in the United States in English are by Latinos. Yet we are going to be 20% of the population. So you have 60 million people being erased, apartheid-like, by the publishing system. And there, I think, are political reasons for that. So my motive, first and foremost, was personal, because I had a story to tell and I had a commitment to that story. And I think if you're going to write powerfully as you can, you have to be committed, because when you're committed, really beautiful things happen. I think, like, you know, most of what we are is not like conscious. Most of what we are is below levels of awareness. And when you commit to something, just like when you have a kid, or just like when you have, you know, like, you know, some young person has a kid, suddenly they were like not very disciplined, and then they have the kid, and then there's super discipline. In the same way, the commitment of your child, of the book, will bring out superpowers in you never had, just like parenting brings out superpowers in you never had. But you have to commit. So that's number one. Number two is you got to be badass in your craft. You have to have, you know, a great story backed up at the level of the sentence, at the level of the paragraph, at the level of the whole structure, you know, something really polished, because it's competitive. We live in a competitive environment. And so I really put a lot of effort to learn as much as I could about the English language. And I just happen to love reading, and I encourage anybody wanting to write to read voraciously, like mad, like your life depended on it. And so, you know, and beyond that, what really motivated me was the absolute the tragedy and the inspiration of the Salvadoran people, of my family, for example, that, yeah, you cried reading it. Imagine how much I cried, not just writing it, but living it. Because there's, I go back to 1932, a mass genocide that family members witnessed. I go into the war that I witnessed and the refugee crisis, the migration crisis, people being killed by narcos, people killed along the way that they might go dying because they're pushed into the deserts. Right now, it's like 3,000 people died between 2008 and 2016 during the Obama era because of border militarization. So, I was, so that was informing my commitment. And those things together, I think, along with the fact that my mother made me love dreamy, mythological, scary, crazy things. And my father was basically an amateur poet, really brilliant guy who had like a second grade education. So that's the best answer I have to that.
No, gracias, Roberto. In your book, you talk about Unforgiving, your title. And I'm wondering if, in terms of people who experience trauma, I experienced trauma growing up in the projects, Ramona Gardens housing projects, big hazard. My family has, losing loved ones. My aunt died, my uncle died due to violence, and my brother died recently. So when people experience trauma, the tendency is to forget, not to talk about it. We see this with Japanese Americans in terms of the concentration camps that a Democrat FDR, put Japanese in camps. He didn't put the Germans in camps. The Germans were the bigger threat in terms of fascism, during that time. He put the Japanese and they bombed the Japanese. But there's this tendency that people, when they experience trauma, is to remain silent, is to not talk about it, and I think that it causes more trauma, right? To keep it inside and not to talk about it. So how is it that in writing your book and looking at your family and with your family history is interrelated with the trauma that El Salvador has experienced from the Matanza on 1932 to the present? How is it that, or how do you think that, is it easier to forget to overcome trauma, or is it easier to remember? Or how is it that you approach this with your title and how you go about this journey of yours?
Well, good question. I think people have to make a choice about their pain and their trauma. You can choose not to face it, and that's your right. And we shouldn't deny anybody the right. Like, I criticize a lot of journalists who will go to a site of a mass killing, or who would go to some natural disaster, or approach a woman who's been raped or something. I don't want to trigger anyone, but who would just kind of dive in, parachute in, say, all right, what's the story? Tell me what your pain. Tell me what you're feeling. And all that does is re-trigger and really mess people up, quite frankly. So I fortunately had people that taught me how to enter into traumatic situations as a journalist. And then when it came time to write my book, I applied it to my family, but also to myself, because we have to be very, very careful. Like, I've gone to, I've been at war. I've been in places where they're controlled by gangs that are super scary, right? Where people are killing each other in large numbers. It's almost like a war, but it's not I wouldn't call it a war, because war is different, but it's very violent, very scary. I've been in narco-controlled territories. I've been approached by people with semi-automatic weapons, asking me questions, and I've been through some stuff. So that's a very dangerous choice that I made. I had to prepare. I don't just do it así nomás. There's an art to it, quite frankly. Hay que saber how you enter the space, how you navigate in a way that you're going to get out. Like when I went through a town in northern Mexico that was completely controlled by narcos, and it was used as a narco training camp for the sicarios. Basically, they were training assassins. So I had to navigate these terrains very carefully. by the same token, you have to navigate your internal terrain as a person that's lived through trauma and pain and suffering, who comes from a family like mine that has gone through this intense experience in El Salvador, in Tijuana, or in LA, or in San Francisco, wherever you are. A lot of us are carrying heavy loads of trauma. So we have to go in there very carefully. And whether you're doing the external adventure or the internal adventure, tienes que estar preparada. You have to do the work like is described in a poem by Adrienne Rich, which is called Diving into the Wreck. And the person's like diving, getting ready, and it's a metaphor, but they're putting on their mask, their scuba gear, and all their equipment to be able to go down safely and to come back up. That's what you have to do as a person if you're going to go into these places. You have to prepare yourself to be really healthy, of sound mind, and to bring out the most courageous, powerful part of yourself. Because one of the benefits, I think, of doing this work is that you start discovering powers you never had. I mean, I'm a regular vato, man. I grew up in the hood here in San Francisco. I never thought I was going to be doing the stuff that I did, whether it's go to war or be a journalist that covers all this stuff and going to scary places and going around the world. And I realized, actually, no, I can start preparado. You can do it. We can do it. We just have to do the preparatory work. And I think it's, if you realize that you pay a higher cost when you don't look at the abyss, at the trauma. If you let it sit there, then you're going to continue the pattern that the state, that the government and the elite powers behind it want you to. Because remember, I've interviewed death squad operatives. I've interviewed military people that have slaughtered a lot of people, evil people. I've interviewed cops that have, assassinated gang members and others. I've interviewed, ex-guerrilla people. And I've interviewed gang members. And one of the things I discovered is that to make a good death squad member, you need somebody with amnesia. Yeah. You need somebody with unresolved trauma. To make a good soldier, you need somebody who's willing to, forget that human life matters. If you want to make a good cop, you have to get somebody who forgets that their fellow human beings are human. And so on and on. If you want to make a good gang member, have them not have an education about why they feel the way the poet Roque Dalton said, que todos nacimos medio muertos en 1932. We were all born half dead in 1932. Because there's this feeling about being Salvadoran where you have a lot of pain and you don't know why. I've talked to gang members who told me the same thing. And when you have that pain and you don't have like a Holocaust museum, you don't have Holocaust education for Salvadorans in the schools, you don't have all this knowledge that helps you understand why you feel that way, then you're gonna do the things that some of us decided to do. So that's why I encourage people to pursue the inner journey, but to do it carefully.
Yeah, you're what my homeboys, when growing up in Ramona Gardens, the big hazard is given the type of journalism you've done, you're what I call a vato loco. You're crazy to have done that, because it hasn't, when my grandmother died in Michoacan, in the rancho with the family feud, I went to go visit her in the rancho, and they were very suspicious of the Huertas because it was a family feud. But once you start asking questions, then you can get killed, just like my uncle Pascual did killed. And it takes a lot, it takes a lot to do that. So I just want to give that recognition.
You say something, and I do encourage people to be crazy.
I tell my students not to be crazy, but go ahead.
I tell people, you gotta be fucking crazy right now. Because look at the world.
Yeah.
If this is normal, if this is civilization, then I'm crazy and I'm a fucking barbarian.
Yeah.
This thing needs to go down. Honestly, look at your world. Look at your government. Look at how dysfunctional it is. And I'm not just talking about Trump, I'm talking about both parties and the limits that they're giving us. They're not offering us things that are gonna improve the condition of the poor. I don't see it. I don't give a shit about Kamala Harris's half Indian mom or the fact that she's Black, quite frankly. I care about the policies that are going to affect Indians in India, that are going to affect Black people. And at the level of policy, we in California know Kamala Harris. So look at the policies. Don't look at the racial games that they're playing, right? We need to be concerned about the policies that are going to either preserve the life on Earth or that are going to destroy it. So yeah, I encourage being crazy.
Right. Yeah, and I'm actually saying crazy in the good way, not in a bad way in terms of risking, doing that risk, right?
Calculated risk, but a risk.
Right. No, definitely. You know, you and I share another thing is we're both from working class communities, and most people like you and I, you went to the university, you have graduate degrees, and masters and MBAs, and I have a master's and a PhD. And unfortunately, for those of us who are at that level, they didn't grow up working class. You know, they grew up middle class. You know, they went to parochial schools. You know, they had privilege. Their parents went to college. Their parents speak English. I mean, for me, when I first heard that parents spoke English in the projects, I was like, oh my God, I didn't know parents spoke English, you know, so, and when I talk about first generation, I'm talking about first generation graduate student, university graduate, I'm talking about elementary school, junior high school, and high school. So coming from a working class background, why is it important to have that working class perspective? I mean, because even we see with the Democrats and the Republicans, and just picking on the Democrats for a while, you know, they always talk about the middle class, but they rarely or never talk about the working class. So why is it important to have not only a working class background, but a working class perspective, right? So like Ben Carson, that Uncle Tom has a working class background, but he sold out his people. But so why is it important to maintain the working class background and that perspective in the interest of the working class, especially when it comes to Latinos and Latinas?
I think in the interest of the working class, but also in the interest of the planet itself. Remember, most of us are working class. The vast majority of the people on Earth, the vast majority of people in the United States are working class people. The middle class is dead. The division between rich and poor in the United States has surpassed El Salvador and other countries at this point in history. So in terms of the division between rich and poor and the separation. So given that, I think it's important that our voices become a part of the national conversations, whether it's in the media, whether it's in politics, or in the case of my book, literature. So we need to be part of the conversation. Otherwise, are these, like in the case of literature, for example, literature itself is a middle class undertaking. Its origins were in the elite and middle class circles of 18th century Europe. And so we've had to adjust this medium that was not designed for working people to try to speak about in an intimate or not intimate way, working class people and working class culture. And like you're gonna get right now a lot of people talking about race that are Black, brown, or whatever, but they're gonna be talking about it in a way that is not concerned with class and the issues of the poor. And so you're gonna have middle class Black, upper class Black, middle class Latinx, many of whom are Afro-descended or indigenous, talking about race and sounding like Martin Luther King, but they're really not down with the people's program that Martin Luther King had. So if we don't include class, then we don't include capitalism in our discussion. And I just was listening to the news about the possible loss of another species. The first species of whale, the right whale, is going to be lost. Generations of kids aren't going to see lions or pandas because they may be wiped out by climate change. And that wasn't caused by the Soviet Union. That was capitalism. You can't argue that. That was capitalism is killing species at an exponential rate. And it could come back for many of us if we're not careful. So, you know, class is a way to talk about capitalism. And that's a necessary discussion because capitalism is killing us.
Definitely, Roberto. And this is something that goes too much focus on race, in my opinion, without focus on class and the role of capitalism. We can't eliminate homelessness without eliminating capitalism, because homelessness is a product of capitalism.
You can't eliminate racism without eliminating.
Yeah, I mean, we live in the richest, most powerful country in the history of humanity, and there's homelessness, and there's people that don't have health care, and there's people don't have shelter. 5 years ago, where I live in LA, you didn't see homeless people under the bridges, and now you see them, and it's just a byproduct of this class system. I want to ask you a question about trust and respect. I think a lot of times academics, scholars, journalists, they look down upon the working class, people that grew up like you and I, and a lot of our students here at Cal Poly Pomona, and the students that you taught at CSUN in the first Central American program in the United States, when you co-founded it with the help of Dr. Rudy Acuña, one of my heroes. I really don't believe in heroes, but he's one of them. Apart from
heroes,
yeah.
Women are going to save the planet, and it's not Kamala Harris or what's her name in Georgia.
Yeah. Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams. They're firmly committed to world-destroying capitalism. They're not going to save the world.
Right, definitely. I totally.
Other women are.
Yeah. Oh, women like my mother, your mother, your grandmothers.
Right now, we brought about a small revolution in Bolivia, for example.
Right.
Those are the women that are going to change the world. Organized, working class, visionary women are going to lead us to another better planet.
No, definitely. I believe in this concept of the wise Latina. I mean, I think the Latina, the Salvadorian, the Mexican, the Bolivian are the ones that are going to save us from this abyss that we're experiencing. But going into the codes that you learn growing up in the streets, trust and respect. How is it that what you learned growing up, how have you been able to use those concepts of trust and respect in your work as a journalist, as a writer, and as an educator?
Well, like I said, good question. Like if you're gonna try to tell a story, you want to be true, right? You want to be true and you want to be beautiful, which is kind of a stock literary idea. And I actually buy it. You got to be true and you got to try to make it as beautiful as possible. Because if I would have just talked about war and ugliness in my book, you and everybody else would never finish it.
Yeah, that's true.
Throughout, I peppered it and I spiced it and it really is about the beauty. For me, the beauty, the terror and the violence and all that was the kind of the black velvet background for that the shining stars of our power and our beauty as a people shines forth. That was really the point. So I always saw that background, and because that's just all that stuff, all the beauty is the reason I don't have a bullet in my head, right? The reason I don't have a bullet in my head, that I didn't take myself out throughout my life, was because of the power and the beauty and the love of people like my mother, my abuelita. Even my father, who was violent towards me, had beautiful things about him, has beautiful things about him. I've resolved things with my father. So I didn't learn to trust as a kid. I didn't know what trust was. I know, and I'm sure many of your students feel that. Our parents don't teach us how to trust because they have secrets like my dad had. They never share with you, but something's there, a little splinter in your mind. Or, they have, people can be violent, people can be abusive, even your own family. How can you trust that? But that's where you grow up learning. So your love is tied up with violence or humiliation. It's like, damn. So I've had a process of growing up, which is a process of learning how to trust. And then I apply that to my writing and to my journalism, because La gente sabe at a very basic level, educated or not, people know if you're cool or not, quite frankly. Basically, it's a basic level like, okay, who the hell is this? Where you coming from? You have to win people's trust to get people to give up the gold in their lives, to share it with you, to share their beautiful and their horrible with you. So trust is important for living and for journalism and for writing. I have to trust myself when I decide to say this and not this at the level of a sentence, at the level of a structure. I have to trust my gut, my heart. That's why practicing and editing is a process of building trust in your own judgment. Those you students out there, you got to trust yourself and you got to decide and go boom, hit it, because that's what writing is. It's never perfect because nothing ever is, but you've tried your best, and trying your best is the closest to perfection that you will ever get. It's the closest to God that you can get. If you believe in God, is you're trying your best. So yeah, trust is huge, as respect. People need to feel respected as an audience or as a source for stories. Even your family, like, I used to be pissed off at my dad a lot. I couldn't have written my book when I was pissed off at my dad, because we'd be, we were fighting, and then we stopped talking for years, and then we had a coming back together. And it's when we started coming back together, then my story takes, not just my written story, but my actual life story took a different direction when I resolved things with my father and I let go of all that molten anger that you can read about in the book. Because I was an angry dude, very angry and crazy dude. So like, my dad was the one who felt that the most, because he's the one who made me a rebel, right? I see somebody in the chat, even in the chat, somebody said like, well, what made you join the revolution? Well, one of that started in the house. The revolution started at home. My dad beat my ass. My dad talked to me certain ways that I hated, and I rebelled against him and the whole family. And I went into like a little clique and became violent. We used to rob people. We used to steal cars. And we used to do fun things like low ride, and hang out and
Listening to oldies.
listening to Malo, Santana, listening to the Midnighters from there in LA,
Mary Wells.
Mary Wells, Brentwood.
There you go.
We had our own subculture that had a beautiful things too. And that's part of what I'm doing in the book too, is showing, look, you have this image of gangs and of young people that's really warped. You forget the beauty. And that's the formula, right? You make the monster and you forget the beauty.
Yeah, that's what I really love about the book. Like I said, I wasn't going to read it until we had a conversation, because I thought I knew a lot about you, and I saw a lot of the previous interviews, not as good as this one, because they're like outsiders coming in, and I'm more of an insider, experiencing similar trauma. When it comes to the father, the relationship between the father and the son, I think that's an important one, especially for the Latino men listening here. In my case, my father was very stoic. He didn't really talk to us. The only time I bonded when we used to watch Bonanza together. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and he didn't really say much. And he only hit me once. Unlike you, I had an adverse effect towards violence. Like, it's something about pain that I didn't really like. So this is one reason I didn't join a gang. I did apply for the gang, but my gang application was rejected because I was too skinny to represent the hood. And I know you were a buff guy, so I think that worked against you in terms of forming that little clique. But I think in regards to the trust and respect that you didn't get in your family growing up as a youth, you got it in the neighborhood, in the streets. Right, so you trusted those homeboys, you trusted those guys that you rolled with, and when you returned to Central America, you were born here, obviously, but when you returned, and so can you can you tell us a little bit about that? How you translated a lot of the stuff that you learned on the streets in terms of when you were dealing with ex-military, you know, one of your escorts, or even dealing with just people on the streets in terms of how to relate to them, you know, how to connect and how to build that trust that's very important for journalists and writers and scholars.
For anybody. One of the things one of the things that was to my benefit was my working class background. Si la gente entiende que has sido pobre, que has sufrido como ellos, they're going to be like, oh, wow. Because I remember being myself as a kid, I would look at people and I would be like, what have they suffered? Esa gente no ha comido mierda como nosotros. They didn't eat shit like us. What do they know? They're coming in here trying to talk to me, school administrator, journalist, whoever came to talk to me. I'd be like skeptical because I didn't feel like they were there to connect with me. They were there to make me an object. So we have to, especially as people, poor people and people that have been racialized, we have to rescue our subjectivity, because the objectification, the making us an object of the gaze, right? Of the racist gaze of the state, of the media, Hollywood, all the political class. They'll have you be nice little Latinx or Latino or whatever the hell you want to call yourself, but they won't really see you as the human being that you are in all your complexity and your subjectivity. So one of the beautiful things about writing is the way, especially like memoir, I get to rescue a part of my subjectivity that was stolen from me before I was born and that continued throughout my life. It's a way to fight back is with beauty and power, right? That's really the way. I see somebody asking me like how I deal with racists. Well, I used to deal with racists violently. I used to beat them up. But that doesn't work for me anymore. I deal with them with beauty and power. I think the best strike back on them is to show them how badass we are in practice. That's like, I'll give you an example. I don't know if I don't know if I'm a badass, but I've tried my best. I'll tell you that. And I joined a revolutionary movement. I was an urban commando. I never talked about that until now. And one of the main reasons, two main reasons. One was I wanted young people to understand what the heart of a revolutionary feels like, because I bet you a lot of young people right now, their heart is beating like my heart used to beat when I was in my 20s. And your mind may be sparkling and like thinking about like, wow, you know, I don't really give a shit about either Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, but what choice do I have? So I wrote the book with that one. The other reason I wrote the book was because Donald Trump. I was like, okay, it's time to present this secret that I've had, that I've held for 30 years almost, about myself. Because I feel like we need to think like poet warriors. We need to be poetic in our fight. We need to be kind of ask the question, what does it mean to be revolutionary? Because revolution is what's going to really help the planet help humanity come back into alignment with the planet, right? Because the planet's like this because of humanity, climate change, and racism, misogyny, destruction. That's an imbalance in the species. So we have to return. So I wrote the book because the racist Donald Trump, fascist Donald Trump, basically communicated to me back in the day when I started this journey in 2015, we need an alternative. So I wrote the book I shared what I think is one of the best sides of me, the sides of me that was willing to sacrifice for others, up to the point of, maybe being killed. And I'm not encouraging people to go out and be violent and get themselves killed or anything, but I am encouraging people to think about what revolution means now. That's how I.
Yeah, no. In my opinion, revolution means love. This is what Frantz Fanon taught us in The Wretched of the Earth. That revolution, in terms of the working class fighting against the oppressor, in this case in Algiers, fighting against the French, it's not violence; it's self-defense, right? So it's legitimate. Nobody says anything when when they justify World War II, which I think it was a good war aside from bombing Nagasaki and Hiroshima, in terms of taking out Hitler and fascism, because it needed to be done. That was a global threat. In the mid 80s, the 1980s, I started UCLA in 1985 as a 17-year-old kid from the projects, and one of the first movements that I joined as a student. And I must say that the reactionary poet Octavio Paz, taught us that the university, they're real actions in an unreal world, right? So the activism that we engage as Mechistas, as Chicano activists back in the day, in 1985, 86, 87, when I was, and one of the biggest, there was two campaigns that we launched that we were part of. One is to free Nelson Mandela, apartheid, to destroy apartheid in South Africa, and the other one is to protest the U.S. intervention in Central America, in this case Nicaragua and El Salvador. And I learned from a brilliant historian, he passed away many years ago, Bradford Burns, about the FMLN, the FSLN, and in the case of Guatemala also, and the role of the United States in supporting dictatorships, not just in Central America, but also in Chile, in Dominican Republic with Trujillo, where the ambassador of the United States once said that they're dictators, they're SOBs, but there are SOBs, right? So for me, solidarity is very important. And as Chicanos and Chicanas, we were part of that movement of solidarity with the people of El Salvador. And I want to say this because I want to move away from this idea that this division between Salvadorians and Mexicans, this division between Crips and Bloods, this division between gangs, brown versus gang, is to move away from that, and that's not always the case. The solidarity is very important, that when we come together for a just cause, like in protesting the U.S. intervention in El Salvador, for example, and not just Reagan, but also Carter in providing military assistance to the dictatorship there in El Salvador, in killing hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians, forcing them to flee. So how do you see that in terms of the important role of CISPES, and in your role in Carece, and in terms of solidarity work with the people of Latin America?
Yeah, I think solidarity is one of those kind of Jedi concepts from back in the day when we had stronger labor unions and revolutionary organizations that we need to kind of bring back right now. The lack of solidarity has us now at a moment where we're trying to say, well, my group matters more, right? I hear Latinos saying this. Latinos are feeling left out. I don't blame you for that, but you're not gonna go anywhere feeling left out and blaming Black people for their struggle. You're gonna get somewhere by joining Black people together, right? On mutually respectful terms. We need, for our part, to exercise our own power as a communities, whatever we call ourselves. We need to do so in a way that unites us with, we're talking about class, we need working class struggle, right? But we also need solidarity across borders. Something I learned, because you've never had in the history of the United States where a refugee community like the Salvadoreños defeated the foreign policy of war and domestic policy of immigration of the most powerful country on earth. Now, Salvadoreños didn't do that alone. It was done with the help of, you mentioned Rudy Acuña. Rudy Acuña named his daughter for a compañera who was involved with us, right? Angela Zambrano, another Chicana who joined and was foundational to the creation of an organization you mentioned, CISPES, the Committee on Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, which was at the core of what was in the 1980s, one of the most powerful people's movements, in addition to the anti-nuclear and environmental movements. So all that is made possible by solidarity. When I was in El Salvador, I met guerrilleras who were German. Like this woman, Paula, I mean, she had this heavy accent, could hardly speak Spanish, but there she was, suited up in a full, with a backpack and ready for combat as a doctor, as a combat doctor. And people from Mexico came to El Salvador, people from Spain. I mean, it was like you read in George Orwell or Hemingway, when people from all over the world went to Spain to fight the fascists. That's how El Salvador was, and it was built on solidarity. Well, we don't have to go outside of the world anymore, outside of the US, to fight fascists and join up. We have them right here. So we have a great moment of history before us, a great opportunity. So I wrote my book to kind of like share some of these experiences so that people could shape their political imagination in a way that's different from all the corporate multi-billion-dollar nonsense that says it matters that Kamala Harris ate pupusas the other day. Who gives a shit? What is her policy towards young Black and brown bodies? What is her policy towards jailing cops? Right now, her record shows she didn't jail a single cop when she was Attorney General of California or the District Attorney of San Francisco. So if that's gonna be at the federal level, we're not gonna get any justice for anybody. So solidarity is important, and we need to rescue it.
Yeah, gracias for that, Roberto. Like all the other insightful responses. You bring up a beautiful poet. I love poetry, and I learned to love poetry through Roque Dalton, my favorite of all time. And I put a quote in the chat here that he said, I believe the world is beautiful and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. Can you talk a little bit to us about someone like Roque Dalton and his role? And I know he was killed from the guerrillas because they thought he was a spy, which he wasn't. But can you talk a little bit about his role and the beauty of poetry and the beauty of Salvadorians speaking for themselves, Salvadorians writing poetry for themselves, and not just talking about violence, but talking about love, talking about being dreamers and imagining a better world?
Yeah, that's my next book, actually.
Well, I got to get 20% of that one because I'm already promoting
my next book. It's probably going to be titled something like Letters to a Young Poet Warrior. Because there's some of that in the book. I talk about what poet warrior, I kind of like constructed this tradition that I feel like I try to continue. So Roque Dalton, his son, was a friend of mine, is a friend of mine. His son, Juan Jose, poet, journalist, and a former guerrillero that belonged to the group that I belong to, the Fuerzas Populares de Liberación. So if you look at Central America, Nicaragua, Guatemala, you have like Otto René Castillo, or in Nicaragua, you have, Ernesto Cardenal or Gioconda Belli and other revolutionary men and women who were also guerrillas. In El Salvador, you had an organization, the Resistencia Nacional, that was founded by poets. So the different, here in the United States, there's this, I think, false and even dangerous separation between the poetic and the political. When in fact, if you live in America Latina at the time that I was there, they were not separate. They were part of the same continuum of consciousness. And I think it's this consciousness right now that we're going to need as we face not just Trump or say Trump's neo-fascist base, or even COVID, or even the economic decline of the United States. Even with all that, we're gonna need something else to face the challenge of our lives, climate change, and the capitalism that created it. So like, in order to face these epic challenges, we're not gonna liberal or progressive our way out of it. That's already a foregone conclusion. We will not liberal and progressive our way out of these epic crises. So we're going to need a whole nother consciousness, which is the revolutionary consciousness. And I believe it's got to be a revolutionary consciousness that does what the poet Arthur Rimbaud in France said during one of the French revolutions in the 1870s. And he said that the poet had to be someone who disorganizes the senses, eyes, sound, hearing, taste, touch. Right now, our senses are being organized by heavy propaganda on the internet, on television. It's all about organizing our senses so that we're quiet, we don't ask the questions that we need to ask. In journalism, in the culture generally, we are being silenced and we're being directed and our senses are being organized. So the poet has to be the one that goes in and goes, disorganizes the agenda of the propaganda system. So that's a beautiful thing. And yeah, the love, if you're gonna be poetic, you gotta go into the breath, into the body, into the heartbeat, into, you know, the eyes, into the memory, into the justice, the pursuit of justice and the beauty in the pursuit of justice and the unforgetting. Because remember, I'm not just talking about remembering. I'm talking about unforgetting, which is different. Remembering is just pulling a file up, right? Unforgetting is pulling up the file that is uncomfortable for the powerful. Whether the powerful is your father in my family, or whether the powerful is la patria, the nation. And I think that's the role of the poet warrior that I'm talking about.
Gracias, Roberto. The way that things are framed, unfortunately, within capitalism, within America, is democracy is like based on two simple questions, or one simple question, you know, do you like Coke or Pepsi? But I'm a radical, so I like horchata, and that's not part of the equation. So to me, that's what radical means. So I think that we need to embrace being radical. And for me, being radical means that health insurance should not be charged, right? So healthcare for everybody. I don't believe that students should pay for university education. I believe that housing is a right, not a privilege, and so on and so forth, right? So how is it that in your advocacy throughout your, you know, many decades of advocating for progressive agendas, for humanitarian agendas, have you pushed this agenda to look at the world, to reframe it differently? And what type of resistance have you experienced from more liberal groups or individuals that try to push back on that they're pretty much maintaining the status quo or settling for crumbs, you know, from all administrations, both Democrat and Republican?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be frank and old school like I can be sometimes, if you'll permit me. But I was taught by Salvadoreñas and Salvadoreños that if you're gonna be effective in politics, hay que tocarle los huevos al tigre. You have to touch the balls of the tiger. Okay, I'm not trying to be sexist or anything. It's just a Salvadoran phrase that means if you're going to go at it, you better go at where your adversary is most vulnerable, where you can hurt or affect them. Otherwise, just be a good Democrat and pay your taxes and have 2.5 cars and a couple kids in your garage and live life. Don't get in politics. What for? Things are good. So I'll give you a concrete example. Like when everybody was all crazy about Barack Obama's election, 5 months in July of 2009, you can look it up on Democracy Now! And just put my name and Shahani, Shahani. Me and my friend Arti Shahani were on Democracy Now! 5 months after Barack Obama was elected. And were we there to say, si se puede? Like all the other Latinos were, si se puede. Were we? No. We were there with reports and facts that showed that Barack Obama was in the process of building one of the most nefarious, massive deportation and immigration systems of, you know, just sinister stuff. 5 months after he was elected when it was unpopular. So what did I get for doing that? What did Artyom get? I got people telling me, hey man, you're anti-Black. You're gonna offend the Black community because you're criticizing the first Black president. Okay, well, first of all, you don't speak for all Black people, because I know, and I have Black allies who condemn the deportation of and the destruction of families, of millions of families. Later on, I said, I have Black friends and allies who say that Barack Obama caging Central American children is not something to be si se puede about. I have Black friends who told me, hey, it's not a good thing that Barack Obama separated thousands of children from their mothers, ripped them apart. Some of them were never to see each other again because the mothers were sent to the other side of the border. I've interviewed these kids. I've interviewed these parents. But my friends in the media wouldn't publish it because it was an uncomfortable fact. So this is kind of a challenge.
That's why I don't get published in the New York Times. I always blame racism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to blame people. I just think I'm realistic. The system has a hard time with some of us because it can't put us in the nice little cage that it wants us to be in, that it wants us to be happy in, right? I never learned to be quiet like that. I never learned to look past difficult truths. We have to look at the difficult truths. Otherwise, you get Donald Trump and Barack Obama, both of whom have proven to utterly fail the fight against climate change, who have advanced a system of caging, separating, and killing migrant children like none previously. They both, so instead of buying the logic of good Obama and Democrats and Biden and Harris, bad Trump and the fascists, I would see the continuum of policies. Look at the policies, look at the different things that Obama laid the foundation for Stephen Miller's caging, separation, and killing of migrant children. I have the receipts. I've heard the screams. I've looked at the little children who had the little scars on their neck because they try to hang themselves. I've met the mothers who try to slit their wrists. So I'm not going to look past that. And if you look past that, you're a coward and you're committed not to justice, but to something else.
Well, gracias, Roberto, for your passion, for your uncompromising positions. Someone asked a question regards to racism. How do you deal with the racists that come after you? I wrote an essay once that simply asked for amnesty, which is really crumbs. And I got death threats. And I just reminded the person sending me the email, like, I grew up in the project, so you better kick back with your death threats. It doesn't scare me. So how do you deal with the racists that come after you when you write your articles that you write in The Guardian and in the Boston Globe and different periodicals, and even in your book, when you expose the racist system that we currently live under, whether it's Democrat or Republican? Let's not forget, like I said, FDR put Japanese in camps. Barack Obama deported 2.7 million immigrants, and the Orange Man in the White House, continued that separation of children from their parents. So how is it that you deal with the racists that come after you when you speak out in this fashion?
Well, I think the first thing is you just have to be committed to whatever your truth and your justice is. If you have clarity of mind and heart about what your mission is, what you need to do, that's the first thing. If you have that, everything else falls from that. Because and so I make sure that I don't engage in petty ass, small time discussions about race, for example, or about any other ism. I look at policies, right? I look at policies. What is the policy of Kamala Harris towards children and mothers here in San Francisco when she was district attorney? Her policy was to hunt them down for the kids being truant. What is her policy towards, what is Kamala Harris's policy towards cops who kill, beat, maim, and destroy Black and brown bodies. Her policy was, if her actions said, not to prosecute any cops.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so then I'm going to bring that out in the discussion of Kamala Harris. If you want to attack me for being racist or misogynist, for focusing on the policies, you're going to have a hard time defeating me.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I've stayed afoot. I just put on Twitter today, I didn't say the details, but I've given them before. But I mean, I had during the Obama era, they tried to kill me in Venezuela. They put a gun and they put it on me because I was reporting on a guy, this guy who basically a fascist, Leopoldo Lopez, who the US wanted to be president of the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. So I went and investigated him for 8 months. And I le saqué los trapos. I showed him he was a fascist. He's a fascist, a violent extremist. But the US media, even Hollywood, was embracing him as he was something else. Like
Right. Yeah.
So I went and I investigated this guy. I got death threats. I got a gun pulled on me. I got a call from a guy who had this Captain America voice named Agent Mike Ranger. I kid you not. Hi, Mr. Lovato. We're concerned about the death threat you got. I said, well, hey, that's really great, Agent Ranger, but how do you know about the death threat if I didn't report it? Well, we're not at liberty to tell you, sir. I'm not at liberty to keep talking to you, Agent Ranger. Click. And then I get human rights lawyers threatening lawsuits against the newspaper, the magazines that I was writing for, the foreign policy. Very prestigious magazine was getting threats of lawsuits along with the Nation Institute that I wrote for. And then there was a hit piece on me in the Washington Post, which, if anybody knows, is the establishment newspaper. All this because of this one article of 6,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
But I held my ground on the facts. The facts were on my side. I had details, research. I had the receipts. Make sure you have the receipts, and that you have the moral high ground, and it becomes more difficult to defeat you. I had a source in the CIA, very highly placed source, former CIA person who was at the top of the chain in Latin America. And he wanted information from me. So I gave him information like a journalist do. You're like, all right, you want information? I want information. So I gave him information. Then he gave me, I said, hey man, I want you to tell me if your people were behind this hit on me. Boom. The week later, I got the name. And it was organized by a CIA asset who I thought it was. This is a true story. I have the receipts. So as long as you stick with the facts, it's the best you can do. Somebody can take you out anyway, but you got to keep your facts lined up so that some petty ass Twitter cancel person comes in and tries to cancel you on race because you're criticizing Kamala Harris, or somebody else from, the CIA or something. If you have the facts as your best protection, fight with facts.
No, gracias, Roberto, for that. And I don't encourage my students to be interviewing people in Venezuela or anywhere else. Please stay away from dangerous situations. And, Roberto he's been around the block a few times. So this is something that you have to be a veteran to do. So even interviewing gang members, I tell my students, just be careful with that, because they can take it like if you're a cop, you're asking questions. So as we're wrapping up, going back to the personal, how is it that throughout this whole experience, you were able to transform from the trauma, from pain to healing? Not long ago, I had a discussion with my brother, Ismael Huerta, and a homeboy of ours, Hector Verdugo from Homeboy Industries. He's like second in command to Father Boyle, who experienced the trauma that we didn't experience. His father was a heroin addict. He died, overdosed. His mother, a junkie, and put into foster care. And so one of the questions I asked him is, like, of all the trauma you experienced, How is it that you were able to overcome that and to live that experience, and anybody who has experienced a level of trauma, whether it's verbal abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse, and come to a place where there's some healing, where there's a transformation, where you can speak your truth and your voice so that you can tell your story that gives people the opportunity to tell theirs, and it's okay to do that, and where too often holding it in is actually part of the trauma. So can you speak a little bit about that in our closing moments here?
Yeah, I mean, I said it earlier, like one of the things that I did to write this was before I started writing it, I did one of the wiser things I think I did as a writer. I got a therapist. Had a therapist so that we mapped out emotionally what I was going to be going through in this book. And then as I looked at the emotional terrain, then I could plan out how far I could go. Because you do have limits. You can't just look at your trauma and think you're going to come through it. You got to be prepared. You got to be muy preparada. Like I said, you got to go back to put on your diving suit, make sure all your equipment's in place, and then dive in prepared. Don't dive in unprepared. If you're going to be unprepared, you could hurt yourself emotionally and otherwise. So being prepared, being committed, because you're going to take a long journey. The journey to healing is a long journey. It took a long time for us to get as screwed up as the planet is. And we're creatures on the planet. So it's going to take a while for us to kind of come through it. Same thing with individual. And I think just seeking out a lot of support, not just a therapist, but family and remembering, I think one of the most powerful things is the power of the sublime and the beautiful to carry us through the dark night. I really believe that. I think that love and children and family and justice and revolution, those are the things, the ideals that help me carry forward to fight and write another day.
Mm-hmm. And also breaking the silence. I mean, you talked about your father in his 90s, and you have good genes. I mean, the fact that your father is 98 or 100 by now, it's amazing. My father died at 67, so I don't have that long to live, given his trajectory.
Wow.
So the fact that you're able, because I do believe, and you say this in your book, this is more like a therapy session between him and I, but everybody can join in, is that a lot of this trauma is inherited, like it's passed down by families and generations, right? So from the grandparents, from the great grandparents to the parents, to the children, and unfortunately, the way the father treats the child in your case, and is the product of how he was raised and in the trauma he experienced. And by opening up, by being vulnerable, by telling your story without being afraid, without being like, breaking this BS machismo that is like you have to be tough, you have to be quiet, you have to be stoic, So I think that the healing process, the seeking out help, those are the successful people. When I was 13, my father was going to get jumped by some of the homeboys because he defended my younger brother who was being picked on by someone else, and they were going to like pretty much beat him up or even kill him. And I was 13 years old, and he gave me his gun to back him up. But he didn't give me instructions. I was like his backup. And then when I was 16, I had a cop pull a gun on me when I did a rolling stop. But it didn't really traumatize me, to tell you the truth, because that was something we were accustomed to. We were numb to that because every day somebody was being killed or somebody was being shot at. And the only reason I think I escaped like PTSD, which most gang members experience, is because I left early. I left the project early at 17 to go to UCLA. But those that don't have that privilege to leave, that stay there, experience those traumas, and those traumas that you experience, you take it out on others. One of my homeboys once said, well, if nobody cares for me, why should I care for anybody else, right? So to me, I think that's part of your story, is not just about your political views or your ideas against Harris or Obama or anybody, but it's more like the personal transformation and to show people that whatever traumas you experience as a child, whether it's neglect or parents divorcing or whatever, there is hope. So to kind of conclude this, can you talk a little bit about the hope aspect of your book or of your story, so that whatever trauma or violence you talked about, but that aspect of love and hope, and so that there is a way out for people that are experiencing this or have experienced, levels of trauma?
I take serious what's happening in the United States and in the world right now. I've lost, friends, distant friends, but friends to COVID. Some and there's people I admire like Sayerikat in Palestine just died of COVID. Others have too. I take very serious what's happening in the world right now, and not just with that, but with the economic decline of the United States and the general decline, the neo-fascist rise. But I've seen some other stuff. I've seen some really bad stuff, and we're not there, thankfully. As bad as things are, we're nowhere near what it is to be in a war. Nowhere near it. Anybody that compares what's happening in the United States to a war right now doesn't know what war is. So it's good to remember that, and that's why I wrote the book, because even in the middle of war, and you could say apocalyptic levels of violence, there's always tenderness.
Mm-hmm.
There's always humor. There's a lot of humor in my book. People say, damn, man, I pissed in my pants reading your book sometimes. I grew up with a father who was one of the funniest people you'll ever meet. For all his bad quality, my dad is funny as hell. And so I think his humor was a survival mechanism.
Right.
My dad grew up in a Great Depression that made John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath look like a wine festival, right? You can't even compare it. It was so devastating. What happened in the 1930s, El Salvador, a genocide, tens of thousands of people. So, humor, tenderness, love. And I think you look at all these young people right now who know there's something wrong with the two-party system. All those young people who were the motor behind Bernie Sanders' campaign. Bernie Sanders is not salvation or the savior, but the young people in particular, and especially the young women in that campaign, are a reflection of what will save the planet. If the young people are committed with all their heart and all their minds not to be fooled by this two double-headed hydra that speaks through both sides of its mouth and its heads for capitalism. Mm-hmm. We have to defeat capitalism. And I think that consciousness is taking hold among many young people. And I have great hope and faith that the young people of the world will not stand by and let this system destroy more species, including the human species. So that's why I wrote this, because in my 20s, I was crazy, and there's some elements of crazy that may be helpful to you. And that's my great hope is you all.
No, that's great, Roberto. That's why you're like a vato loco here from the streets, but taking that to a higher level, in terms of your rage or your anger, it's more against terror, against injustice, against capitalism, against a system that oppresses our people.
For humanity.
For humanity. For me, I'm actually happy that I participated in the campaign, not like for voting, but for the last 5 years to defeat Donald Trump, since he came down the escalator with this trophy immigrant wife, calling Mexicans murderers and drug dealers and thieves. And I'm kind of relieved. Well, I'm not kind of, I'm relieved that we're not going to see, him in the White House anymore. And I kind of held that there was like a moratorium on my part to not criticize Biden and Harris until they took office, because sitting out this election was something that I don't think we could was an option. but I never really participated at the electoral level. I never really have faith in that. My faith has always been like the way you're talking, in the people themselves, the people from the streets, the grassroots organizers. And I agree, the Latinas, the Black women, those are the ones that, when I'm feeling, I don't really, my family, I have a history of depression that runs in my family. So I talk about this in my classes, and I talk about the importance of therapy, the importance of seeking help is important. But I've never really felt, faith in the system that way. The only faith that I've experienced is that when Mr. George Floyd was murdered by the police, is that Black people, brown people, Asians, white people took to the streets to demand racial justice. And that's what gives me faith, is the young people, like you say, of this nation, not the government, but the people, in particular young people, that regardless of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or religion or lack thereof, that they took to the streets to demand justice and to seek a better world. So for me, I want to thank Roberto. I know we took him a little bit over his time, and I want to thank everybody. Not that my students had a choice, because I'm the man here. I'm gonna oppress you with not passing you. But for me, this is important because too often when we talk about Latinos and Latinas, we hear the narrative from white people in power, white journalists, white authors, and we don't hear from the people ourselves. Or even when we hear from Latinos and Latinas, we hear from people that grew up privileged, their parents went to college. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because I want my son to avoid the hardships that I experienced. So I make sure he didn't do that. But from a different perspective, from a perspective of a radical perspective, and by radical, I mean radical in the sense that it doesn't compromise the injustices that take place, regardless of where it's coming from, right? And it doesn't matter where you come from. It does not matter, where you start from. Like Vicente Fernandez says, it matters, where you're going, in terms of, what direction you're leading to. And unfortunately, there are few people to speak on behalf of Latinos and Latinas in this country, because our narratives are not being told. So we need to tell them. And I would end with this, that I think Roberto provides us an example of whatever circumstances you grew up in or you're facing now, then you too can tell your story. You too have that power in you. You just need to harness it. You need to learn, you need to study, you need to work at it. And it's not gonna come easy. You're gonna face discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, but you just need to fight on. And like my tía says, sí se puede. So muchas gracias, Roberto, and gracias to Cal Poly Pomona, to Chris, and everybody at the library.
My honor and privilege.
And I think both of us were dressed like Johnny Cash here in black, so I think that was a coincidence. We didn't.
I'm dressed like Zorro, bro.
Like Zorro. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you all.
So gracias todos, and we'll see y'all in next week. I'm gonna have a similar talk on art, the barrio, and Chicano activism. Like we say in East LA, muchas gracias, and see y'all soon.